I think I'll call us to order. We've given folks plenty of time to trudge in late from the cold and find a nice warm seat here in Bucknell Hall. First of all, thanks very much to everyone who's here tonight. We certainly hope to see some of your faces as well in some of the other events that we're going to be carrying out in this series throughout the year. This is the first of 6, what do we want to call these, talks, conversations, speaker events, phenomena that are going to take place over the course of the year, in which a group of us here at Bucknell has done some work to try to provide a forum for some fairly open-ended discussion of some really big political, social, cultural questions that I think a lot of Americans are interested in. And these are questions that have to do with the legacy and the consequences of the events and the social movements and the change that took place in the 1960s. So the first thing that I'll say is just if you're interested, if you don't already know about the rest of the series, there's a very long URL that I could give you, but I think the easiest way to give you in terms of direction online for more information is just if you go up into your browser and plug in Bucknell and 1960s, you will fairly safely turn up among the first couple of hits. In fact, I think the first 2 hits will be first a Bucknell story, a little Bucknell article on the series, which is up on the Bucknell website. And then you'll get the blog for the faculty group that put the series together, which gives you the full outline of the speakers and also gives you the full outline for the 5 films that we're showing over at the campus theater that are related to the theme of the symposium. I'm not going to say too much more than about the series at this point, and I'll allow you to do that research on your own as you care to. I will say though that the next speaker event that we're doing in the symposium is on November 8th, right here in the same location. In fact, all the events are taking place here in Bucknell Hall. It's a site that I just deeply love for the atmosphere and for a whole bunch of reasons. So the next one is November 8th. We're having Professor Mark Bauerlein, who is a professor of English at Emory University and also an editor at the journal First Things, who will be coming out to talk about another chunk of the 1960s and their ramifications and consequences. Professor Bauerlein is mostly going to be talking about changes in the educational system in the United States, and especially changes in higher education, which is something he's been interested in and has written a good deal about over the last decade or decade and a half. So that's the second event. Tonight's event, though, is the one that we're most concentrated on. So let me say just a little bit in the way of introduction about our guest, and also very briefly about myself and about my Bucknell colleague who's here joining us among the 3 of us here on stage. Professor Todd Gitlin is, how to say this in the pithiest way possible. I think he certainly is among the most widely recognized analysts and speakers and writers on the broad themes of the 1960s that interest us in this symposium. Certainly in my own thinking and my own work and research on this topic, as I was going through the list of people that I wanted to come when the faculty group that I was part of were initially thinking about doing this symposium, he was probably the first name that came to my mind. I've been reading Professor Gitlin for decades now, at least, I think at the latest, starting when I was in graduate school in the 1990s. I think I might have read a little bit of the Whole World is Watching, even as an undergraduate, but my memory is hazy enough about that time because it was long enough ago. Certainly by the time I was a grad student, though, I was an avid reader, and I admired just the depth of analytical detail, the ability that he had because of his unique placement as both someone who lived through these events as an activist and as a participant, but also someone who then went on to think about them as a scholar. Just the depth of the scope and the vision. It may be most important for me, though, I think, was the fact that he was just a tremendous writer. And we were talking a little bit about this tonight, maybe bonding, in fact, a little bit over the sense that here are 2 people with PhDs in sociology who mutually recognized and admired as a compliment the statement that both of us have heard over our careers from some colleagues that we don't write very much like sociologists. I quite like that, and I quite think that certainly is the way that I read Todd Gitlin from the very beginning. So he is, the formal details are he's a professor of both journalism and sociology at Columbia University. Has written 15, 16 or so books and working on another one at present. 16. Very wide-ranging in terms of genre, all the way from sociological studies of media, and specifically this classic book that was among the first of the books that I ran into, which was a study of the media coverage of the New Left in the 60s. He's written political analyses of the Occupy movement and of various other political phenomena. He's written books on political strategy and thinking about social movements for the very general audience. This Letters to a Young Activist from a few years ago, which I think is one of the single texts that I recommend whenever I get students who are interested in doing activism. I say, go read that book to start. And he also has written a number of novels, and in fact, the book that he's working on currently is a novel about the 1960s. We're going to talk a little bit about, I hope, about that book. So, so I hope we will all have a lot to learn from Professor Todd Gitlin tonight. My name is Alexander Riley. I'm a professor of sociology here at Bucknell University. That's enough in terms of details on me. This is my colleague, Jennifer Silva, who's also in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and who has, I'll say a little bit more about her than I just did about myself, because I think she's been so invaluable in terms of what she's contributed to in the way of work on the organization of this symposium. And the two of us have brainstormed together a good deal about the content of the questions that we want to put to Professor Gitlin tonight, but also other organizational matters and who we want to bring in as speakers and so forth. So I am hugely indebted to Jen Silva for the work that she's done here to help. And so I think the format is going to consist of the two of us going back and forth and offering questions to Professor Gitlin that then he'll speak to, and we may or may not massage them out a little bit as we decide moving along. After about an hour and 15 minutes or so of that, I think we'd very much like to turn it over to the audience and to see if any of you have any questions that you'd like to put to our guest tonight. So again, thank you very much for coming, and we hope you'll find this. I'm sure in any event that I'm going to find this an incredibly exciting evening, and I hope some of the rest of you will as well. Okay, so we didn't draw straws on this, but I think the order as it worked out is such that I'm going to do the first question, and it is a question that has to do with this novel that you're working on at present. Your forthcoming novel, which is titled The Opposition, is inspired by your experiences in the 1960s, and perhaps particularly experiences in the year 1968, which is we're at the 50-year anniversary of that year. An excerpt from the book published by the Smithsonian deals with the riot at the 68 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Would you tell us more about why you decided to write this book at this moment, and why did you choose to write a novel instead of an academic work of nonfiction?
So first of all, thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for this format, which affords me the possibility of coming uncorked or spinning out of control here, because I like the looseness and openness of it. You may come to regret it, but... So I've been trying to write this novel for more than 40 years, okay? This is probably my fourth shot at it. I was a writer before I was a sociologist, and I was a writer of several kinds of genres. But the books that inspired me the most for my first book, which was a book about poor whites in Chicago, are still in some ways lurking in the background of my approach to reality, if you will. The James Agee of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the Oscar Lewis anthropologies, narrative histories of mostly of Mexicans and Puerto Ricans encountering the United States, and John Dos Passos' series of novels under the name USA, which amalgamated narrative novelizing, poetry, sort of documentary films on paper, little little historical vignettes, biographical vignettes, and so on. So I have had a desire for a very long time to bring everything I have as a writer to an encounter with reality. And so no sooner were the 60s over than I made a pass at this book. In fact, I started writing about Chicago. That was around 1973. I was out of school. I had no particular interest in an academic career. I was writing this and writing that, journalism, poetry, whatnot. And I even then wanted to convey the texture of the experience, which I already understood to be bizarre. I had a very bizarre experience of life in America as an activist in the New Left. And of course, the ideas were of interest to me and the passions were of interest to me, but mostly what I was trying to do in that aborted book was to get a feeling for what it felt like to do that kind of activity and to be that kind of person, which I understood, I think, accurately as a very odd experience. Well, I didn't get anywhere. I wrote a few, I don't know. I didn't write very much. Then I went back to graduate school. I remember once, around that time, I think while I was in graduate school, I heard somebody quote Hunter S. Thompson. He said, "When the going gets tough, the weird turn pro." And I felt that spoke to my condition. So I decided to get pro. I went into the PhD program at Berkeley in sociology. And as soon as I had gotten my PhD, which was in part built on experiences I had in the 60s, but analyzing them through the prism of how media were playing a part in the developments of the 60s, which wasn't being much thought about, or certainly not being much systematically thought about at the time. But no sooner was I done with the dissertation, I tried to find my way back into the novel. And I wrote some more in the late 70s. And then I put it aside for, I guess, what became my next book, sociology book. And then as soon as that was out, I went back to the novel. And then I was approached by a publisher to write the more or less history of the 60s that was eventually published under the name The 60s Years of Hope, Days of Rage. And actually, I was reluctant to give up the novel. I still knew that I wanted to write multidimensionally and that I didn't want to be bound to fact. So I had to put away that ambition in order to, I agreed to write the book. I put away the novel. I started to write the book. I tried to write it from a distance. It was crap. It was just dead on the page. And I had then one of the very few writer's block periods of my life. I think it was about 3 weeks when I just knew what I had been writing was dead. And so I put aside what I had started to write and I started rewriting in the first person, which much of the rest of the book continues. And I was very happy with that book. It was published in 1987. And afterward, I still felt a pang, a kind of what if or an if only, that I had abandoned the novel, now 3 times started. But c'est la vie, and I would tell myself, and I think I've said it publicly on more than one occasion, that I had accomplished what I had been wanting to accomplish in the novel by writing that book, which was partly memoir, partly rumination, partly history, partly analysis, and so on. And yet the phantom novel never quite went away, and I wrote all kinds of other books and did all kinds of other projects. And about 7 years ago, the bullet bit me, and I made another start on the novel. But I started elsewhere. I started with some characters who were not me. So I mean, the book is basically done. I've worked on it for about 6 years. And I would say still that I was trying to do in the last several years what I was originally trying to do in 1973, to convey a way of life. For years, I've read a ton of books about the 60s, and there are certain kinds of 60s experiences which I think were common and formative and in some ways definitional, which have not been properly encompassed in fiction. One of them is really something that will sound banal. What's it feel like to be at a political meeting? I remember I found one writer, not a well-known writer, maybe 10 years ago, who had a chapter about a meeting, which felt right to me. The texture of it seemed right. But that was pretty much unique. And for a long time, I even wrote about this. Given how many writers or amateur or aspiring writers went through the 60s, how come we didn't have fiction that was adequate to it? And because I looked at a lot of books and they were wrong. And I recurred to a line once from Norman Mailer, who said something that sounds kind of banal, but it's sort of for some reason it struck me. He said, a novelist has to have a sense of the real. And what my interpretation of that, and the way that addressed the problem of where was the 60s fiction, was that I think that a lot of the people who passed through the kinds of experiences I did lost a sense of the real. Because the real shook, the real shimmied and blurred and upended us. And so to try to get a handle on it was very difficult for many writers. For example, I'm an admirer of much of Philip Roth's American Pastoral. But when he writes about 60s characters, they seem completely phony to me. He didn't get them. So I dared think that I got these people. There were other kinds of experience. For example, the very common experience of women getting illegal abortions, which is something I knew about. Actually, the heroic abortion doctor in question lived not far from here, in a town called Ashland, Pennsylvania. A famous man who, I think it's fair to say, rescued many thousands of women over a long period of time. I thought, okay, that's a kind of experience that's now, thankfully, unusual. To get an anonymous, to write a letter and then get a telegram back saying be at such and such a place on such and such a date and bring $50 or whatever it was. I think it was $50. And then you're in this small town where half the cars parked on the street are with out of state plates, and the police are in evidence, so obviously they've been paid off. And so on and so on. I mean, many such experiences, but those are examples. Meetings and an abortion are sort of formative. So this is a long way around to say that after everything I'd written and thought about the 60s, I needed to come at it, or at the immensity of what happened, through life stories which would be partly rooted in actual experience, but partly imagined. And I wanted to do it big, so there are about 8 major characters in the book. None of them is exactly me. And I want also, I care about writing as such. I wanted to be able to evoke how the world appeared to people, what it was like to think you could actually change the world. It's a bizarre, today, there are people like Mark Zuckerberg who think they can change the world, but I don't think they have much of an inner life. But there was, I knew these remarkable people, and I wanted to, in a certain sense, to do homage to them. So that's why I went to this novel.
We might come back to the novel. I have a bunch of things I'd like to follow up, especially who these other characters, if any of them are modeled on actual people.
By the way, but you mentioned the Smithsonian excerpt.
Yes.
So there's a small tale here. The Smithsonian magazine, every 5 or 10 years, I get asked to write about '68, and I've done a lot of it. And I got a letter last summer, I guess it was, from an editor of the Smithsonian. He said, we're doing a special issue on the 60s in the fall, and will you write something about 1968, maybe centered on Chicago? And I wrote back, I said, truthfully, I'm really bored by this. I mean, I've done so much of it. I don't actually want to do that, but as it happens, I'm writing a novel, and I'll be happy to let you see it. I think we sent him, my agent, I sent him the whole thing. And then and I said, I know this is going to seem bizarre to you. I mean, it's because you're not a magazine of fiction. But I really think this is true. And I was quite delighted that the editor got it. I said, yeah, okay, we're going to run it. And they did run it. It's fiction, and it's true.
Yeah.
So I've spent the last 3 years in a declining coal town about an hour from here in Pennsylvania. I've been interviewing working class and poor people about their political beliefs and behaviors. And I wanted to bring in a story of someone I interviewed to ask how you might understand his life in the context of the 1960s. So this is Roger Adams, a 38-year-old white man who is the grandson of a coal miner. He has a high school degree, and he used to work as an EMT, but he's been out of work since 2009. He's in chronic pain. He spends his day lying on his recliner with an orange pharmacy bottle on the shelf above his head. And so Roger voted for Barack Obama in 2008. But his criticism of the Democrats today is that they do not do enough to sustain people like him, like they did in the past. And so when I ask him who he's planning to vote for in 2016, he explains, I'm a Democrat, but I hate Hillary. My dad was a Democrat. I'm going to stay Democrat for him, but I'll never vote Democrat again. He says, at one time, the Democrats helped our family. They really did. But now they don't do enough to help people. They don't do enough to create jobs, to get people back to work. So in 2016, he decides to vote for Donald Trump. He actually writes Donald Trump a letter asking to help him get back to work. And offers to be on his personal security team if he's able to do that. And so Roger, a few minutes later, he starts crying. He's remembering his dad, a Vietnam veteran. He tells me, I don't care how much I hurt, I'll always salute the flag, I'll always stand and cover my heart. When I ask him if the American dream is alive, he says, I think it's dying. I really do. He says, for some people, maybe the refugees, it's alive. But for anyone here, it's dying. He tells me that the government needs a totally new overhaul. He says, clear everybody out, start over. And at the end of the conversation, he asks if I've ever played video games like Fallout, Fallen Earth, or Stalker. And he tells me, you see those games like on Xbox? You see how it looks like a wasteland? That's how America is going to look real soon. It's going to be a civil war, and it will be real nasty. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on this perspective, given your experience as a public intellectual and activist. And how would you think about the views of Roger Adams?
Well, can I go autobiographical in a way?
Sure.
Although I never met Roger Adams. But I spent 2 years in Chicago in the mid-'60s as both a writer working on a book about poor whites in Chicago, many of whom were former coal miners or from coal mining communities in West Virginia and Kentucky, Tennessee, and so on. And as an organizer in that group, among those people. And I have very vivid memories of that time. I think we were onto something, the movement, Students for Democratic Society, which had decided to go into community organizing, were really onto something that we were unable to deliver on. The civil rights movement, now let's go back to 1963. There were people active in the civil rights movement in the South who understood that through all of their efforts and given the political configuration at the time, the civil rights movement was going to succeed. It was bound for glory. That is, it was going to succeed in abolishing segregation. And it did. And those were the years when we got a Civil Rights Act, and next year we got the Voting Rights Act. And there were already people in the civil rights movement. One of them was Stokely Carmichael, later a very well-known leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who came to us, the white radicals in SDS, and said, you know, we need to create an interracial movement of the poor. We are going to need a movement that federates poor black people, many of whom are Southern sharecroppers, with white people who are either actually or prospectively unemployed, and we need to find a class basis. So there were about 100 of us who had been campus activists who left the universities in 64, 65, and we set up a dozen or so projects in northern or border cities. And I was in the one in Chicago where we were where we met people like this. I mean, my book, the book Uptown Poor Whites of Chicago, is largely narratives of people like Roger talking that way. Okay? Now, we made some efforts. Some were more successful than others. As it happened, first of all, it was extremely difficult to organize welfare mothers. That was one big category of our work. Young guys, sort of tough young guys harassed by the police. There was another constituency we worked with. We worked with tenants who were getting screwed and tried to get landlords to sign contracts to keep up their houses and so on. I mean, we did that sort of thing, and it was very hard. And it was not only hard, it was hard, and at the same time, number one, the economy was relatively good, in part because of Vietnam War spending. And secondly, many of us in the student-based left were now beginning to respond to the Vietnam War. And so many people stopped doing that kind of organizing work in order to work directly against the war. By the way, there's a whole section of the novel that involves that kind of organizing work. Now, you know, I think it was an excellent idea to try to create a cross-race, cross-class movement, because we understood there needed to be middle-class allies and so on, and we had, this whole project was funded originally with money from a union, from the United Auto Workers Union, so we understood the need for a sort of a general coalition. We didn't think it would be easy. I think that, you know, such efforts have been made. We were not the only ones, and they failed. You know, I mean, it was a disappointment to me. We were talking about this before. Barack Obama had experience like this as a community organizer in Chicago. He wrote about it beautifully in his Dreams from My Father. But he also found how hard it is to actually empower and mobilize and strategize with people who basically are disenfranchised. I don't mean necessarily that they don't have the vote, but that they feel helpless. And part of the work of an organizer is to convince people who feel helpless not to be helpless, how to overcome their learned incapacity. So, great idea, still needs to be done. And in the inability to get that done, or our collective, now I'm speaking not just of the student left, but of liberals in general, the failure to mobilize, failure to root the Democratic Party in particular in that kind of commitment the failure of, to put it over simply, the failure of left-wing populism or left-wing nationalism left the door open for you-know-who. And here we are. And I mean, I think this is, by the way, not simply an American tragedy. I think it's a tragedy throughout the world. I mean, the success of the egregious nationalisms that are now all over Europe and coming up in Brazil and India is in no small part a consequence of the inability of the social democratic left to sound like it means it, to offer something to people who feel displaced, disenfranchised, encroached upon, and often enough, by the way, develop really savage ideas about who's at fault, like it's the fault of dark-skinned people, or it's the fault of Muslims, or it's the fault of Mexicans, or what have you. But the grievances are real. The sense of having been abandoned is real. And so, you know, it's on us. It's not only on the vile and inexcusable demagogues who are frolicking today, but they have not been given. These people have not been given something else. Not just to believe. It's not just that they haven't been given policies. They haven't been given. They haven't been shown a spirit. Okay. Now I hate the spirit of Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, but it is a spirit. It mobilizes people. It excites them, and you cannot defeat that with a program. You cannot defeat that with gestures. You cannot defeat that with a list. Hillary Clinton presented a list. Donald Trump presented a diatribe and a cast of evil characters to blame. That's where we are.
Follow up?
I'll follow up with
A little later, okay.
Or,
Yeah, I
yeah.
have a lot that I'd like to
I
do
know.
there as well, but we'll hang on.
Okay. Yeah.
We're going to this question now. So this, you were just speaking about your book, The 60s, which is a book that I've used as a kind of textbook for a long time now in the course that I teach on this topic. On that book's last page, you write the following. And now, question mark, my generation numbers teachers more activists than their students, rock stars more anti-establishment than their audiences. This is mind-boggling for a generation that believed that youth had the privilege of vision. But the 60s returns are not in. The activists are not necessarily finished. End the quote there. Couple of questions. The first is, does youth have privilege of vision? And what should we as a society do with the seemingly perennial aspects of generational conflict and difference of perspective on the most important of matters? How much should youthful idealism be cultivated? And how much should it be tempered by the insights of elders? What do you think, broadly speaking, the lessons of the 60s were on this? And then a second question, they're both extending from the quote. Are the baby boomers finished politically? What's the upshot of what that generation has contributed to the country and to the culture as of 2018?
Okay, well, let me take them in reverse order. First of all,
Sure.
I despise the concept of baby boomers. Hillary Clinton's a baby boomer. Donald Trump's a baby boomer. I'm not, by the way. I'm a war baby. Baby boom technically consists of people born between 1946 and 1964. Now, there were years when there were 4 million American babies or more born. The notion that all these people can be clumped into a category that sort of functions as a unit, as a phalanx, as a platoon is ridiculous. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are only a few months apart. Donald Trump is living culturally in the 50s, right? He's the 60s of Hugh Hefner, who invented that type in the 50s. Hillary Clinton obviously comes from somewhere else. But taking, so consider this, 1946 to 64. It means if in 1965 there were baby boomers who were 19 years old, and there were baby boomers who were 1 year old. How can you think of them as a political unit? That's ridiculous. So, end of diatribe against that concept. I think it's lazy thinking to think there are generational differences, and it matters a lot. How old you were, when John F. Kennedy was shot. How old you were when the Vietnam War accelerated. How old you were when Rosa Parks refused to sit on the wrong side of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. That matters, but to think that the whole generation of people were acting in a phalanx is ridiculous. When the civil rights movement was very small. I mean, there were a few thousand people who were active in it initially, maybe a few hundred, then there were thousands, but not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. The first, I helped organize a demonstration in Washington in 1962 against the nuclear arms race and nuclear testing, and we were thrilled because we got 8,000 people to a demonstration in Washington. I mean, that was 8,000 people. What's that? Today, you got 8,000 people. You name any issue you can name, and there are 8,000 people, and then some, in 50 cities in America who are turning out to shake their fists about something or other. SDS, when I was president of the organization, had about 1,500 members in the whole country, had maybe 20 chapters, of which maybe half were real, the other half were on paper. We were not representative of a generation. And this infamous or famous line, don't trust anybody over 30, so it's worth reviewing the origin of that statement, which was held to be representative of my generation. What happened was this, there was a free speech movement, and it was the first massive student movement in America, fall of 1964. And the president of the University of California, among others, blamed this upsurge, which was completely nonviolent, and whose issue was, do students at the University of California, Berkeley have a right to organize around off-campus issues? And the refusal of the university to permit that was what inflamed a whole student movement. So the president of the University of California said this was all the doing of communists. So a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle sat down with one of the leaders of the free speech movement and said, well, what do you think about President Clark Kerr saying that this is all the work of communists? And he laughed. And he said, communists? We don't trust anybody over 30. Okay? He wasn't talking about elders. He was talking about a particular slice of the communist world of the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, of course there were generational differences, and they were very important. But there was so much more going on in the 1960s than people making declarations about what generation they belonged to. Now, insofar as they did, there were many people who went off the deep end, and who, I'm talking about my generation, and who said things like, famously, Jerry Rubin, one of the leaders of the so-called yippies, kill your parents. That was loathsome, stupid, and indefensible. But sure enough, by the way, there were also lots of people over 30 or 40 or something whose view was, kill the young people. I mean, Ronald Reagan, now kind of softened in behind the gauze of history, said early on during his tenure, his first term as governor of California, if there's going to be a massacre, let's get it over with. He was talking about massacring young, radical, liberal activists, countercultural people in California. So my view of the generation thing is, there's some reality to it, but it always takes 2 generations to play. And for the most part, we, the youngers then, were on the receiving end of a line of argument to the effect that we were betraying everything that America stood for, that we were making America no longer great because guys were growing their hair too long, or girls were having sex, or any one of it, and we were violating the law and civil disobedience, and we were disabused of the virtues of American foreign policy, and so on and so on. So yes, it was a dimension of what happened. And I, now that I'm a few generations older, I think that there is something of a built-in tension because of the ways in which people encounter history differently. It really, if the first political memory you have is of the trade towers being blown up, that shakes you and shapes you in a way that it doesn't if if your first political memory is the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Kennedy-Nixon election, or et cetera. So yeah, generation's a real consideration. I think it has to be taken for granted that there are going to be tensions in experience, because we're talking about life experience here. And when you have big blocks of people who share a life experience which is different from that of elders or youngers, you're going to get tensions and divergences of interpretation. That said, one thing that has interested me for a long time about these perennial researches into the 60s is that it's not just people like me who were there. I mean, a lot of people are interested in the 60s. What's that about? I sometimes think, so it's now 50 years afterward. So if somebody had proposed in 1968 that we have a get-together, that we have an event, that we have a newspaper report about what people were doing in 1918, I wouldn't have been interested. Nobody in 1960, I got to college in 1959. Nobody I knew was interested in the music of the World War I era. There are elements. The culture changed, and there's a reason why even young people know who the Beatles were. Many, not all. There was a student I knew, or a friend of mine, a colleague of mine at Berkeley, once had a student say to him, "Who was Malcolm the 10th?" And there's another story, maybe apocryphal. Did you know that Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings? But, the truth is that something big happened. Many big things happened. Feminism happened. The gay movement happened. And they have a trajectory which continues. The Me Too movement has a root there. And so the 60s, my sort of one way I have of understanding the 60s at large is that there were so many subterranean phenomena that erupted, that surfaced in the 1960s. All kinds of unresolved matters, relations between the sexes, different kinds of sexuality, relations between races, question of what America is in the world, the question of what is of value, the question of what education is for. All these things erupted, and they didn't get healed. Very little got healed or solved. But what did surface, and again, moments like this in history are rare, when what surfaces is so deep that it sticks around. I mean, it doesn't end. Nothing was resolved, and so there are reinventions or reconsideration, redistributions of the old stuff. As we learned from Mr. Kavanaugh not so long ago. So this was deep stuff, and that's why I think the '60s continue to have a life. I think almost every presidential race since 1968 has somewhere or other been a fight over who won the '60s and who deserved to. And that's for good reason. It's not just the sentimentality and the gauzy memories of journalists. I think I only got to your second question, but
Yeah, does youth
if
have
it's still with you,
vision?
you can
That's
ask
such a
it
big
again.
one. We can maybe safely come back to that one as well, because I think we want to, again, try to do as many, at least at the first flyover level of the questions as we can, and come back to some toward the end.
So I want to follow up about the struggle to define America, or the battle to define America. So in The Twilight of Common Dreams, you write, "The new left proved largely uninterested in celebrating or proposing a common American identity. The new left had been unimpressed with the common man. Many student radicals insisted on being uncommon. The movement found it hard to summon up faith in American redemption. A common American identity, if there ever had been one, was either a hoax or a menace. Thus did young insurgents imagine themselves storming away from the overstuffed American way of life. In the process, the idea of a common America, if there was one at all, was ceded by default to the right. So is there a common America? Is there any possibility in the contemporary US of finding common ground, of recreating a sort of sense of we? And if so, what do you think this we would or could be based on? And do you think it is politically productive to question or reject this idea of a common America?
Who was it who wrote "America is Hard to Find"? Was that William Carlos Williams? I'm sorry, I'm
America is hard to
technologically
Yes, help.
disrupted.
We have technical aid on the way.
Oh, thank you. Just in time. So, a great anthropologist named Benedict Anderson wrote a really important book called Imagined Communities, which is about nationalism. That's what a nation is. It's an imagined community. None of us has ever seen the United States of America. It's not palpable. Somebody once said, a Norwegian friend of mine once said that somebody else had defined a nation as something with an army, a navy, and a dictionary. So it's a myth, it's a fantasy. That is to say, it is susceptible automatically to divergent interpretations. It's hard to get your mind around, as we say. And the notion that a nation, which in our case pretty short-lived as nations go, that now has something like 3.25 million people, could be crammed into a phrase, into a definition, is on the face of it ridiculous. That said, we live with myths, by which I don't mean untruths, I mean notions of what matters here and who we are. And these change over time, and they're almost always in conflict. That is, they don't line up along a single dimension. And sometimes it's more apparent than at other times that there are conflicting definitions. And we fought a civil war in 1861 precisely because of how wildly and violently people disagreed about what the United States was. Was it, I don't have to go into that. So I think one thing that modern media have done has been to take is to force the various versions of America to get into each other's faces in a way that earlier was not so easy. So if you were a farmer in Virginia, you didn't actually know very much about the lives of privateers in Boston. There simply wasn't much contact. And so in a certain way, it was possible to live in ignorance, not in dispute, but in ignorance, a kind of coexistence with the unknown. But for a very long time now, in no small part because of media, we have contention over the meaning of things. And that those contentions were very vivid in the 1960s. Now, some people were saying, when I got to college, by the way, we were said to be the silent generation. That was the word about my crowd. And that's sort of how it looked for a while. But then, lo and behold, all kinds of things start showing up as contestable. Race, foreign policy, et cetera, education. And then, so people will start saying, where did all this come from? Well, the feelings were there. When Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, and she talked about the disease with no name. And she was talking about the alienation and sense of bereftness that housewives felt, what were then called housewives. This had been around. This was a post-war phenomenon, and but she called it a disease with no name, and she named it. And then suddenly said, "Oh yeah, I got that disease," and that was an important moment in the inception of the women's movement. So when people start having names they can attach to different kinds of experience, then what was diffuse and cloudy becomes crystalline. And then they say, oh yeah, I'm with these people and we're against those people, or those people are against us. This is oversimple, of course. But what this amounted to was that the prior ideas of what America was, which had been taken for granted, disbanded. They were like pillars of sand. And then suddenly everything was up for grabs. What is good music? That was something I think many or most Americans could agree about in the 1950s. It was Doris Day, it was Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, it was Guy Lombardo on New Year's Eve and so on. And then all of a sudden there's other people making other kinds of noises. Elvis Presley, what is this? Sam Cooke, what is that? And then, so the sense of the unitary America is already in collapse. And that's what happened in the 60s. And you know what? It never got put together again. And you know what? Donald Trump's not going to put it together. If anything, he's only accentuating. Make America Great Again is a brilliant slogan. And it's also a fundamentally misleading slogan for a variety of reasons, one of which is that it posits that there's a single America. My America, I have to say, has very little in common with Donald Trump's. But I understand what values matter to him. And I think what surfaced in the campaign and since is a realization that we are at least two nations, that they are fundamentally divided, that, I'd like to know Roger, and that I would probably be able to find out in a conversation what we had in common. I've known people like Roger in the past from my Chicago experience, and I think I would find that I have probably more in common with him than either of us has with Donald Trump. I'd like to think that anyway. That's my pious wish. But a nation is also, this is sort of another banality, it's a conversation. I mean, a nation is not like this object. Once this was a chair, it'll always be this chair. No. It exists in historical time. It's being reworked and reconceived endlessly because it exists in historical time. It's not a thing. So this is a long-winded way of saying that the quest for the unitary name or the unitary rubric is touching in a way. It's a tribute to a longing, but it's also doomed to being either partial or completely failed because it's so complicated. What the complexity of America is just staggers the imagination, and deserves to. I mean, that to me is a great thing. So I guess I'm coming around to saying that if you don't get the variety of America, you don't get America. I mean, that's sort of got to be one central thing about it. Good God, drive around this country, and it's kind of staggering to think, that we are a single nation or nation state. And we may not be forever, by the way, because the cleavages are really significant and they're fundamental. These are value conflicts. And they tore us apart once in a very bloody war, and they might well again.
You read my mind in coming back to Roger, because I was thinking maybe we have enough on the table at the moment that we can circle back and do some elaboration. So the question that I had, in part going back to Roger and some of your response to that question, if I'm remembering correctly in your response to that question, you talked about the importance of a spirit in motivating folks to get politically involved and to move in the direction of a set of political endpoints. Is it perhaps the case that some of the vocabulary that you tend to see, you just very nicely laid out how the 60s is a particular historical moment when a lot of the very widespread, the very widely accepted set of discourses that united a bunch of Americans started to break down, at least for some chunks of the country. Is it possible that maybe we're getting at something of an explanation as to why spirit, if you will, comes a little more naturally for folks on the political right than it does for folks on the political left, because they still use some of those old discourses. I mean, the most central one that jumps out at me as I'm talking is religion. And we have lots of survey data on this that show that there is, if you look at red, blue, right, left divides, the numbers are quite interesting in terms of commitment to religious, especially more traditional / conservative sets of religious principles. So I'm interested in hearing you maybe elaborate a little more on how, in responding to the Roger Adams question, you said the real project for the left is to try to find a way to speak in that language of the spirit to the Roger Adams. How does the left do that, given that, as you said, a lot of what's going on post-60s has maybe impoverished their discourse on some of those issues?
So, rhetorically speaking, the virtue of demagogic exclusivist nationalism is that it's the great simplifier. America's our tribe, but it's not your tribe. That's kind of a ready-made answer to a whole lot of questions. Go away, get out of here. Once upon a time, they were saying, go back to Moscow. That doesn't have the same ring as it used to. But today, it's more like, you don't look like you come from around here, or that sort of thing. It may be, the missing spirit what are we? What are we? To me, it's not simply a matter of political vocabulary. It is a matter of spirit. It's a matter of, is there a common music? And I don't mean that literally. I don't mean literally music, but that's also one thing we lack. I mean, how many musics do we have? How many? The national anthem is hardly anybody can sing. Nobody has ever, nobody knows what the words are. Most of the words are never even sung. It doesn't enliven. I mean, in part, what's pathetic about the upheaval about Colin Kaepernick and the others is that people are getting exercised about this national anthem, which has so little connection to contemporary life. Comes from 1812, and it's not rousing. But God damn it, you don't like my song? You're not willing to stand up for it? Then I know you're my enemy. Great simplifier. When I say that there needs to be a spirit, I don't know exactly what I mean, but it's certainly something that's missing. It's an embracing notion of what we are, what we have in common. When I was a kid, I liked reading Carl Sandburg, and I read many times this book-length poem he wrote called "The People, Yes," which is very romantic. It's a kind of a somewhat sentimental, rather sentimentalized version of Walt Whitman, who I dearly love. But it was at least an attempt to affirm a commonality that, regardless of difference, was a commonality. I mean, Whitman is our great poet for that reason and deserves to be continually renewed as an exponent, because these great lumbering long sentences with all those clauses, which were basically long lists of everything that he found kind of stirring and weird and interesting about America, those were ways of describing the big we. It's sentimental, it's romantic, it oversimplifies, it leaves things out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it has a spirit, and when I first read Whitman when I was in high school, I felt it. And I still do. I think that the tragedy is that we do not have political leaders or rhetoricians who are skilled or maybe heartfelt about presenting that sense of the commonality. Maybe the politician in my memory of the last couple decades who came closest to it was Mario Cuomo, who gave this great speech at one of the Democratic conventions about the American family. That was his metaphor. Obama made a pass at it also in his way. This is a loving and embracing idea. It's not a hateful idea. I mean, what is so dreadful about the current racketeer in chief is that the central emotion that is at work in him is so obviously hatred. A spirit which overrides hatred, a spirit of love, if you will, and I will, is something that reminds people of their connection to others. Not just people who look like them, not just blood relatives, but the whole human thing. And we don't have either the politicians or the rhetoricians, and maybe we don't have the university professors either quite, who can evoke some large sense of a common destiny. And that's a very serious shortfall. And by the way, I've written critically of the left for for defaulting on its mission, which is to speak that language. I mean, I think it's been evident for a long time that, it's certainly been evident since the late 80s, that the left has been more interested in perfecting Group A's sense of its difference from Group B than in convening what in parliamentary procedure they call the committee of the whole. That's a serious default, and so the right ran away with it because exclusivist nationalism, as I say, is very easy to put across. And rage and suspicion and fear are the readiest emotions for mass broadcast.
Any follow-up questions that you want?
I was very intrigued by the idea of America as a conversation, and it reminds me of many of my students, some of whom are here, who think that conversation has become impossible, and that even on campus they feel like their relationships with people who don't think like them are just hostile, and they feel division and judgment. So how does one begin this conversation or have this conversation, even at this very local level on campus?
I do not think it's easy, and I don't think I'm especially good at it. I mean, there is something of a therapeutic notion that it can be helpful to, at least for certain conversational purposes, to say, okay, let's put aside what we disagree about. Let's concentrate for a moment on what we agree about. And then we'll find out whether we're Americans here together. Let's take a look at this. I think that's a worthy exercise. I want to tell a story. Something just popped into my mind. We were talking before at dinner about prisons. I had some remarkable experiences a few years ago. I went to visit a prisoner, political prisoner I would call her, at Rikers Island, the big prison island in New York City. And on one of these occasions, I was waiting to see this young woman who'd been arrested and beaten and then charged with felonious assault on a policeman. And there was a visitor, somebody, there was over on another side of the room, there was a visitor who was yelling at an official, a prison official. And really scurrilous, profane, harsh, vicious, and seemed really quite menacing. And then he came out of that part of the room and he started charging around and kicking chairs and pounding lockers. It was kind of a scary moment. And then there appeared a guard. I guess he was an officer. He was wearing a white uniform. Sort of very striking looking man, short but very stocky, big shoulders. He was black and the troublemaking, angry guy were black. So the guard walked up to the troublemaking guy and sort of stood there and sort of as if to say, you can't yell me away. And finally the guy subsided for a minute. And the guard looked at him and he said, how can we move this forward? For me, it was a great moment, really memorable. And the guy cooled out. The guy first of all, I mean, you didn't want to attack this guy lightly. He was husky and looked muscular. But I've used that line since then. I've in family fights, I've used it, and even when I haven't used it, I've thought it. It's always a good question to ask. So, I mean, I'm not answering your question, but because you have to look at I'll tell actually another story I just heard the other night. I went to a fundraiser for the Democratic candidate for Congress in the 19th Congressional District, which is where I vote. And he told the following story. He had, the previous night, his name is Antonio Delgado, and he's black. He's running against an incumbent Republican. And he told this story. He said the night before he'd been at a town meeting in the town of Kinderhook, which is up near Albany on the Hudson River. And he had a big crowd. But as he was entering, he saw there was a big flatbed truck parked out in front. It had 2 huge American flags on it and a sign that said Trump. The guy was there, okay? He went in, he did the rally. Delgado left. When he left, the parking lot had emptied out, except this guy was still there with his flatbed truck. And Delgado was walking across the parking lot to get to his car, and the guy yelled out to him. He said, "Hey, Delgado, come over here." Delgado said, I didn't really know what this was, but okay. Delgado's a big guy, it should be said. So he went over to him, and the guy then wanted to give him a piece of his mind. He said, I want to tell you my story. And his story was something like what you've reported. This guy had lost his small business when the financial meltdown took place. His house was underwater. His life had turned very bad. And Delgado engaged him in conversation. He said on some things they could agree, on some things they disagreed, but he said it was a serious conversation. And I gather it went on for quite some time, and eventually Delgado turned to the guy and he said, "So let me ask you, you going to vote for me?" And the guy said, "I'm going to think about it." And I thought, well, this is really impressive. Delgado is actually a natural politician, I think, but that's a politician in the highest sense. There's somebody who appreciates the opportunity to have a conversation, which means also sometimes listening to things that you hate and trying to figure out how to relate to them. I don't think anybody can write a manual about how to have a political conversation, but I like such moments when people encounter each other and think that there's value even in a clear expression of divergent views. It doesn't have to come to a happy ending, but it's valuable insofar as it's itself a rich human experience. Actually I'm talking myself into it now. Why is it so hard for me? Because this is my better self speaking, okay?
Let's bring everyone else in the room into the conversation and see if there are any questions from the folks in the audience. We have a couple of students who've got handy mics that they can run out to folks. So I saw a hand over there.
You weren't very encouraging to me for the next election, for the next process, in what lack of rhetoric, lack of communication skills in the Democratic Party or other party. Do you think we're kind of in a situation where I've seen the pendulum swings? We've had 8 years of the parties changing. The person in Ashland, it doesn't matter to them who's there. Are we just in the pendulum? Because you don't encourage me with all your with the background where we're going from here.
As the great Yogi Berra is said to have said, I never make predictions, especially about the future. I don't know where it's going. But I tend to doubt that we're in a pendulum swing for a number of reasons. One is that I think there is an old order that is fading, as Mr. Dillon sang a long time ago. Well, he said rapidly aging. Well, it was, maybe it is rapidly aging. In many countries, and the United States is not just one, the the more or less stability of the party system has been shattered. And we just saw it in the elections in Bavaria. We're seeing it in Brazil. I think saw it in Britain, and in Italy, and in France. Now that I think of it, it's extremely common experience. And why is that? I think it's because there was an order that was reasonably stable as long as the economic underpinnings were passable for a sufficient number of people, for a critical mass of people. And that's over. The neoliberal or globalist or what have you dispensation, although it has achieved important things, I mean, it's brought a lot of people out of poverty around the world. Let's not neglect them. But it has absolutely nothing to offer in the face of flagrant and rampant inequality. It has nothing warm to offer in the face of racial and ethnic and religious antagonism. It is all, especially in the United States, political parties are amalgams of divergent forces. And that's been true for a long time. I mean, there was no single Republican Party. Ronald Reagan was quite brilliant rhetorically in his ability to take several different strands, business republicanism, white supremacy, neoconservative aggressiveness, old-style small-town republicanism, and other elements as well, and fuse, and pro-business obviously central to it, and amalgamate them into the appearance of a central, of a commonality. That's become much harder to do because of for a variety of reasons. Call it polarization, call it fragmentation, and call it also, I call it a moral and cultural crisis of many dimensions that is upon us. So those entities like the political parties that have tried to wrap their diversities under a common label haven't worked. I mean, the Democrats obviously have a great deal of trouble being the big tent that, in my mind, is the only successful strategy for them. But they're not very good at doing that, and maybe disastrously bad at doing it. I mean, Hillary Clinton, sort of one way of summing up the pathos of her campaign, in my mind, was the slogan that she chose, "Stronger Together." What does that mean? What does that mean? Now, she didn't have, of course, Obama said a change you could believe in. I'm not sure what that means either. But somehow he could personify because of his personal qualities. That's sort of, the change you can believe in is me. And, that was compelling enough. Stronger Together is meaningless to vast numbers of people in America. Make America Great Again, at least it has an echo of something. I mean, I don't like it, but it's rousing. Exactly. So, all this is to say that I think history has accelerated for all kinds of obvious reasons. The world is, whether you like it or not, it's globalized, like mad. I mean, so that a torture and murder in Istanbul is a global event, virtually instantaneously. And under this setting, I think that instability to me is the name of the game. Therefore, there's something kind of quite regular about a pendulum, And I don't see it that way. I think we're going to see all manner of combinations and permutations of political sentiment, some of which will be quite horrific, and some of which may surprise us with their generosity and novelty. And if I knew what they ought to be, I would quit my job and do something else. But I've never before so strongly felt that, and I started thinking this right around the time of the election. If I have an unsatisfactory slogan, but it's the only one I can live with from day to day, it's all bets are off. Anything might be coming. Civil war is possible. Secession is possible. Nuclear war is never to be dismissed. It's always got a non-zero probability. And by the way, you know that Greenland is melting. And we're pretty far inland here at the moment. But, so instabilities are the name of the game now. And I don't think anybody, right or left, has actually got an adequate handle on it. It presents us with, among other things, what I will call, begging your indulgence, a spiritual crisis. And sort of what is, if the right of the Koch brothers and Donald Trump has to offer endless effusions of toxic materials into the atmosphere that will transform the earth irrevocably, if that's what they have to offer, what is the big picture that we have to offer is a very serious question that has not been, I think, even properly asked. This is what I think ought to be debated in the Democratic Party, not a lot of the trivialities that have become central. I mean, the human condition is now in an unprecedented situation. Can I just go on in this vein just for a couple of minutes? We've now had about 4 centuries of the burning of fossil fuels. That's all it's been. And here we are in a qualitatively different game and a qualitatively different relation to nature than was ever before possible. Ever. Because, and this is not reversible. That's why the pendulum is also misleading. Although Trump played with something like it the other night, didn't he? He said, well, it gets hot, it gets cold, We're in an unprecedented circumstance. And so I think it would be foolish to think we know how humanity will cope with this, or let alone how a political party will cope with this. But we're in a convulsion, which is spiritual and intellectual and political and economic, and is full of, it's riddled with irreversibilities. One thing, many people, think about the financial. So what happened, Roger's story. So the other day, actually, I had to give a talk in New York about Trump and media and trust and so on. So I looked at the number. You can't really trust polls about trust either, quite. But leaving that aside, I decided I really wanted to know what the polls have been saying about trust in news media over the last 40 years. So I looked up the numbers. And so during the Nixon years, trust in media was very high. And then it withered in the 80s, it started to come back. By the late 90s, it was almost back to where it was in the 70s. majorities of people said they had, for what this is worth, either a great deal of or a fair amount of trust in the news media. It was more or less 60 on the trust side, 40 on the no. And then, you know when the break point came? It was from 2007 to 2008. Okay, so you went from more or less, so this is my inadequate memory, more or less 60-40 trust to 60-40 mistrust. Now, did the media do something especially egregious in 2007, 2008? I mean, I could give you a lot of criticisms, but I would have to say no. So what's that about? Why did the trust upend? My hypothesis is that this trust in the media is a proxy, or it's a stand-in. I think that America lost faith in its institutions, and reasonably so, because of the abject failure of everything in the financial crisis. And, you know, some people thought, and I think Obama thought, many Democrats thought, okay, well, whew, we weathered that and now we're through it. But that was shallow and wrong. And what we discovered is that that's not reversible. You know, and so much, whatever Donald Trump says, you know, coal mining is never going to do it again. It's never going to be what it was in employment, in the space it occupies in the energy ecology, if you will. So irreversibilities, you know, sort of once you're over the cliff, you don't, Humpty Dumpty doesn't get put back together again. And that's why I think all bets are off. Sorry?
Not to encourage.
I'm doing my best to tell the truth that I think.
Any other questions?
So, hello. All right. So, you kind of spoke of the unity of the American political left, or lack thereof. What do you think would be a step in the right direction, and how would you classify that or describe it? You spoke somewhat of a song. What would be the nature of that song, do you think?
What would be the
nature of that song?
Well, it would be hopeful, but not stupid. It would be romantic, but not fatuous. It would be inclusive. It would be forgiving. If you can imagine a song being forgiving. It would lift hearts, but not stupidly. That is to say, not in a phony way. I mean, that's the best I can do. I've written a few songs, but they're lousy, and so I'm not the one to. This is not for me.
It's a difficult business. Yeah.
I mean, now, you know, we could. Arguments about popular culture are always interesting and insoluble. To me, the musician who's come closest to being able to find this spirit is Bruce Springsteen. But obviously, there's a whole chunk of America that is not stirred by him, although some of them, you know, purport to be. I mean, Chris Christie apparently was tracking Springsteen around New Jersey on every opportunity, though certainly didn't share Springsteen's politics. But, you know, and I'm not a huge fan of Chris Christie's, but maybe Springsteen has had a note that that found him. I mean, but it's very hard to do. It's really, I mean, we can look at earlier periods in American popular culture. okay, the so-called popular front culture of the 30s and 40s included, some quite literal songs. I mean, this may strike you as an odd thing, but Frank Sinatra, who was a liberal Democrat for much of his early life, had I think won a Special Academy Award around 1946 for a short film in which he sang a song called "The House I Live In." And I'm not sure who wrote it. I think it was also sung by Paul Robeson. But it was this sort of a New Deal song, if you will, but I mean, on a plane of harmony. And it was that kind of musical work, which also cropped up in Aaron Copland's symphonies. Robeson was a very good exponent of this sort of uplift, which was certainly cognizant of trouble, of historical trouble, but was friendly. Okay, the house I live in, the people that I meet. I can't remember the other lyrics. That what is America to me? I guess is a line in there, right? That's what America is. It's the house I live in. It's the common house. Okay, I live in it with all of you people. That was the spirit of it. Now today, who would put that on the air? I mean, that is not nearly bitter enough or nasty enough. But I'm sort of a creature of that spirit in some ways. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, we've got one. Good.
I'm reading a book called White Trash that's received a lot of talk among the critics. It's about the history of class in the United States with a focus on poor people in the South and the borderline states, and I find it to be fascinating. I'm impressed with the way it was written. The author is very detailed, but she's down to earth, and I wonder if you read this book.
No, I've read reviews that it's a book I mean to read.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had read it, and it explains a lot of the basic feelings that low-income people have about the world they live in. And I think anyone who is trying to work as a progressive should read it. And it's very informative and also somewhat inspiring, but it's written in a very down-to-earth way. She doesn't beat around the bush. She tells things like it is. And she's also an academic. She's not a popular writer. So, okay, I hope you can read it someday.
I'm glad it's out there. I'm glad you reminded us of it. We certainly need, part of the, I think the impoverished nature of our current cultural situation is that books are hard carrier, are not sufficiently compelling carriers of the far-flung sentiment that needs to emerge. So because so few people read books, let's face it, we're creatures from the lagoon here. We need movies, we need television, we need videos, we need a whole array of cultural forms that arrive to people's ears and eyes in forms that they recognize. You'd be shocked to know how few copies of a book have to be sold in order for it to land on the New York Times bestseller list. We're talking about, there are certain parts of the year when there are books that appear on the top 10 best-selling list that have sold maybe 20,000 copies.
Anyone else? Well, oh, we've got another, yes. If I just wait long enough, right at the end, someone will come in. Good.
Do you think that a Donald Trump presidency could sort of re-enliven the necessity for unity for the American political left? Do you think that that could spread the message to people that unity is a very serious issue?
You'll have to forgive me because my hearing is lousy.
Yeah.
So could you say it again?
Do you think that a Donald Trump presidency is enough to awaken the American political left and sort of resurge the necessity for unity?
You know, part of what was thrilling to me about what called itself the New Left in the early 60s was that it spoke American. It didn't sound like it was translated from a foreign language. Wasn't academic. It wasn't, if it was, pompous in some ways, it was at least sort of originally so. It was, and it was written by people who came from the Midwest and were not corroded by academic language, although they were well read. And I think it's, this actually bears on the question of who are we and, what does it mean to be an American? One of the bad things that's happened in the universities over the last 30 years is, a move that I think of as sort of a retreat from real politics. A lot of academics have trained themselves and been rewarded for writing in, what should we call them, jargon, professional languages, which are not welcoming, they're obscure, and they have all kinds of nasty social functions, like dividing the world between those of us who get it and those of us who don't. And, the left, certainly the academic left is really disgraceful in this respect, in my view. It's actually not doing politics, it's doing something ecclesiastical. It's doing something it's establishing a pecking order, a status hierarchy. So, again, I'm not a fan of slogans like "Make America Great Again." It's a disgrace. But there is a kind of language. Read Abraham Lincoln. Okay, Abraham Lincoln, who was a great writer, who never went past the third grade, complex thinker, wrote in the common parlance. Franklin Roosevelt himself, from an aristocratic family, went to Harvard and all that, but he could speak American English beautifully, so that people could see themselves in his description of them. And we don't have that. You're not going to find it from, as I said, the only example I can think of from recent history was that speech of Mario. Mario Cuomo was a considerable orator, not a good politician, but quite a wonderful orator. And I think, having lost that, even the ambition to speak that way is tragic. The left, after all, if the left is not, if the left, whatever we mean by that, does not aspire to speak in a common language for the people, then what the hell is it? Is it a club or a group of clubs? Is it anything more than that? And that's why I feel so alienated from the organized left. And Frank, one of my passions for the last year plus has been trying to get people registered to vote. And I really am saddened by the fact that There are lots of people working on that and getting involved in get out the vote campaigns and so on, but very little of that is coming from the campuses. And to me, it's mind-boggling that people are busier, sort of scrutinizing each other for microaggressions. And when there are swings districts up for grabs in 2 weeks, and that's where it's at. You're going to shape the rest of our lives. So to me, this is I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I'm just getting this off my chest. To me, this is it's a sign of the decay of a tradition, and it's not auspicious. It may not be permanent, but it has to be recognized as a problem. I mean, as an urgent and formative problem. And I don't think it is. Yeah.
Any others?
But this also could change.
Well, I feel like as soon as I start to say something, someone's going to raise their hand. So, but it hasn't happened yet. So I'll continue. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And again, we hope we can look forward to seeing some of you at some of the subsequent events, both the other guest speakers that are going to happen during the course of the academic year, and also the film series. The next one, I'm going to get the date wrong probably. I think it's the 24th of this month. So next week is Stanley Kubrick's film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I certainly encourage folks who are film buffs to drop by the campus theater next week for that one. And we'll have 3 more films after that, 5 more speakers in the series after tonight. So again, thanks very much for your attention, and stay warm out there. I think it's going to be cold this evening.
Thank you.
And please, thank you, yes, to our guest, Todd Gitlin.